You're very welcome, everyone, to episode 3 of our Work From Anywhere series. Today, we're going to be talking about culture and community. We'll be hearing from Rockson, Joanne Mangan, and Paul Bennett, moderated by Aurelie Krau. Next week, the topic is going to be all around HR, payroll, and wealth management. We'll be hearing from Melton Curran, Kathleen DiPaolo, and Francine Keating. So tune in next week. In the meantime, enjoy episode 3.
And good morning, good afternoon, good evening. No matter where you are in the world, this is a very global webinar. I'm delighted to be your host this week again for the 3rd episode of the Work From Anywhere series. What we are, really working hard on is to make work from anywhere a reality, making this from a myth to reality. In this 3rd episode of our series, I will be joined by 3 amazing speakers. And just before that, let me just introduce you to the topic and, do a quick scene setting. So this week, we will focus on the people side of remote working abroad, mainly diversity and inclusion, culture, and community. We'll be talking about building a remote work culture and the associated challenges that are diversity and inclusion. This was actually brought up in our very first episode with our remote work experts. We're going to talk about the importance of cultural awareness and cultural intelligence for remote workers and how to build a remote work community and make it local. Just before being joined by our speakers, I wanted to focus on the why, that topic in particular. Because, usually when you think about remote work from anywhere, we talk a lot about the direct effects of this huge shift. What comes to mind is tax management, compliance, legal aspects, employee benefits. These are pretty obvious, actually, but the real question we want to address today is what are the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th effects? Typically, the merge of business and leisure travel, how this is going to be dealt with within organizations, between the corporate travel function, mobility management, finance, real estate, the HR aspect as well, that is very important here because it's about people management at the end of the day, right? Culture and communication, equity, diversity, inclusion. So to set the context, there's one company that pops in mind straight away, and that were amongst the first ones end of last year to announce going fully virtual. It's Dropbox. And one of the reasons of this fully virtual shift that Dropbox have announced is exactly inclusion, because they wanted every employee to be on the exact same level and every employee to be a remote first employee. It's actually pretty interesting because when you dig in a little bit, work from anywhere is probably not applicable for all industries or all companies. It might be job specifics, it might be industry specifics. And it turns out that companies that are highly regulated, like financial services typically, will probably not be able to implement this largely due to data security risks or regulatory issues, right? And also companies with fixed locations, typically manufacturers, are less likely to implement that. But turns out that companies with highly mobile workforces will definitely be looking at this, and the massive shift is on its way. The Netflix company culture talks about how high performers are 10 times the average worker in creative industries such as tech or entertainment, versus 2 or 3 times the average in more traditional industries. So that means the ROI of making work from anywhere is very different in a traditional manufacturer versus a high growth tech startup. So I guess this sets the scene. And welcome to all of our viewers again, for those who have just joined us. I would love now to, yes, exactly. Thank you, John, in the back scene, to bring our three speakers with us, Tayo, Joanne, Paul. And I think I wouldn't do justice if I introduce you because you have three fantastic profiles. So I would like to start by a quick intro. We're going to start with you, Tayo. Can you introduce yourself? And please share with our audience why is it so important to loop in culture, community, diversity, and inclusion in a growing distributed workforce?
Well, thank you so much for having me, and you did a great job of setting the stage. I describe myself as a cultural translator and a storyteller. So as a cultural translator, I run a diversity, equity, inclusion firm. I'm also a speaker, writer on the topics of cultural competency, cultural intelligence, and anything to do with connecting effectively across cultures. Also a professor. And through stories, I like to tell stories that make people feel seen, heard, and understood. I think diversity, inclusion, and equity, and belonging, and accessibility are all important right now, as they've always been in a distributed workforce, because it's a chance for a lot of people to reshape narrative, create more opportunities, and to reinvigorate the existing company cultures. I think there are multiple opportunities now for people to really hire people that might have not been quote unquote hireable before, but also create policies that do make it easy for people and that were told that it wasn't their time, or they weren't ready for in different parts of the world, as well as different parts of the United States if you're looking local, or England if you're looking local in that area too.
Love it. Perfect. I think that sets the scene perfectly. So create new opportunities and even enhance trends that were here before this big awareness.
Right.
Joanne, I would like to hear your thoughts on that. And can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Aurelie. And hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here as well today. I think this is a really great event and some fantastic speakers alongside me here. So my name is Joanne Mangan. I work for an organization called Grow Remote. I'm Irish. I live in the beautiful west of Ireland. And nice. Grow Remote are a non-profit organization. We're on a mission to make remote work local. That means we want to make remote work visible and accessible to everybody, regardless of where they live. My role is employers lead, so I help employers to transition to remote, and I work with a number of leading remote first organizations to try and learn from them, understand how they do it and how they have been doing it for years often, and then trying to translate that into knowledge that can be shared with the wider employers community. Grow Remote also have a very wide community of remote workers that we engage with, that we support, and that we enable. We have over 140 remote working chapters around the world, predominantly in Ireland, but we actually have chapters all around the world. My background is I've come from the tech world. So before I joined Grow Remote, I worked for a number of tech organizations in leadership roles. I'm also a gender equality advocate. I recently completed a master's in gender studies and globalization in Ireland. So I'm very interested in the topic of remote work as a driver of social change, in terms of building sustainable communities, in terms of transforming how we live and how we work systemically from a social perspective, and also in terms of the opportunities the remote work can bring for diversity, for bringing in people who maybe couldn't thrive in the traditional 9 to 5. So with that in mind, why I think it's important, I think we've just come through quite a seismic shift. There's been a big bang in remote working. I never would have thought a couple of years ago that we would be here today where so many people have worked remotely. But with great change can also come great, brilliant opportunities, absolutely fantastic opportunities, but also risks and unintended consequences. And I think those are all in the area of culture, in the area of inclusion, in the area of community. I think we can build the policies, we can develop the technology, but when it comes to these areas, these are critical in terms of really impacting people's quality of life, being able to realize those opportunities and make sure that we don't make things worse. In some cases, when we talk about things like inclusion, we talk about things like diversity.
Love it. Yeah, that's actually a big challenge, right? Because it's as if not an entirely blank page, but there's a lot that we still have to figure out. And I love the idea of creating communities and making it local, and we're going to get to that during our conversation in a minute, but the topic of isolation and loneliness is quite often tackled as well when we talk about remote work. And thank you to our audience for being engaged. Keep going, send us your comments, tell us where you're tuning in from, and in a minute we're going to start taking your questions. Paul, you're our third speaker today. Can you tell us and our audience what you're doing and why do you think diversity, inclusion, and cultural intelligence is particularly important when we talk about work from anywhere?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wish you hadn't asked me to introduce myself third, because it's two very tough acts to follow, and I'm feeling like very much the sort of last one in the door. So thanks for having me on.
Okay. You'll be the first one I ask for the closing question.
Yeah,
Paul.
exactly. Get in there first. So I'm Paul Bennett, one of the co-founders and CEO of Perchpeek. As John has kindly put up in the banner, we help people relocate around the world. So we help them find their home, get their bank account, make sure they're settled in nicely, ship their stuff, everything that goes into relocating, and we sort of guide them through that process. And whilst we're quite a young company, so we don't really know life pre-pandemic very much. It's been an interesting last year because
I like that.
because the style of relocation is now changing so much. Instead, certainly in our world, instead of traditionally lots of big companies saying you have to come to our London office, you have to come to our San Francisco office, what's happening now is there's clear benefits in terms of people not having to relocate for their job, but also all of these people that have had to relocate going, wow, I can go live in the countryside, I can go be closer to my family, I can go have a little bit more space. And that's been a really, really exciting change over the last year, as employees have sort of voted with their feet and said, well, actually, we kind of want to have a bit of ownership where we live, rather than be told by our company where we live, which I think is a huge opportunity in the work from anywhere space. I think in terms of, whilst there are massive benefits for D&I and community and culture, one of the big risks and one of the things we think isn't being spoken about enough is that and this is a very sort of Western European and American bias, but as in lots of countries, we start to come out of the pandemic, some people start returning to the office. What's going to happen with that culture? Because up until now, it's not really been proper remote working from anywhere. Often it's been sort of forced working from home, almost regardless where you are in the world. And how are companies going to think about that? As they have pockets of people that want to go into an office, potentially pockets that don't, and it just requires a lot more active thought to create a good culture. And I'm looking forward to hearing Joanne and Taya's thoughts on this, because some companies are doing an amazing job of thinking about that and creating an inclusive world. But if you're not, then you might end up seeing a bit of a two-tier system, which is something that I think might crop up.
It's perfect. You just did my job. You did the introduction. The perfect transition for my next question to Tayo. But yeah, we did touch that with Rowena, and particularly during the first episode, Rowena said that work is actually not a place, or not a place anymore. And it's very true as well to say that right now it's not exactly remote work. It's work from home that has been forced, and we're in a pandemic still with a lot of restrictions, right? Yeah. So it kind of does make sense. And I ask that question a lot as well to people around me. What's your company strategy? What's your company workplace strategy? Are you going to go hybrids? Do you going to go remote first? Is it like a resident type? Are you all going to be back to the office? And people are actually looking forward to getting back to the office. But again, nobody has a crystal ball. But to your point as well, Paul, I believe it's also because we lacked social interaction so much in a year, and companies were not all ready for that because they didn't necessarily have the right processes, the right company culture, remote culture in place. That, of course, it makes sense that people want to go back to the office, kind of, but how long is it going to last? That's the thing. And to make that transition, Tayo and Joanne, I think before we dig in, I would love just to pause a little bit and just explore what do we mean exactly when we talk about inclusivity, diversity, gender equity. What does it mean? And especially, what does it mean in the workplace? And what is changing in a distributed workplace? I don't know, Tayo, Joanne, who of you wants to start?
Well, after you, Joanne.
Well,
I'm letting you to decide.
I mean, that's a big question. So I'll touch on a couple of things that from my point of view, what it means, what diversity and inclusion and equality means in the workplace. I think maybe I'll say what it isn't. Oftentimes it isn't what a lot of companies are doing at the moment. I think companies do try to make their workplaces more diverse by bringing in certain policies. You know, they might set goals to have certain number of women in leadership, for example. They may have hiring quotas for people from marginalized or underrepresented communities, but they don't really get under the hood of why these issues happen. And I think that's where I think remote work is as a driver of social change can help improve on that. What I mean is, let's take women in leadership, for example. So I know a lot of great companies who have, put great targets in place to have more women. They understand the value of having women in leadership. They understand it from a business point of view. They understand it from a moral point of view. They do things, what they think are the right things to try and bring that in. But what often doesn't happen is the culture doesn't change. So the impediments that women often face in terms of moving into leadership roles, they aren't really impacted by what the companies are doing. So remote work, there's potential there to help that situation, because it's a real structural way of making, let's say, for example, women who have younger children, to support them so that they don't have to pull back from the workforce during those years where they have their younger children. They can still be visible, they can still be present, but they have flexibility. So I won't say they can have it all, because I don't believe that's ever possible, but they're moving closer to that place where they can manage their caring responsibilities and they can develop their careers. Now, there's a whole world around that about why is it women that do this, that I won't get into right now. But for me, I think genuine diversity, genuine inclusion means not just window dressing, but looking at the underlying root causes, the structural impediments, what's really happening in your organization, what's your culture, what are your women in the organization, what are people telling you, and making the shift towards moving the needle on some of those cultural issues. And remote work for me is a key driver. It's not the silver bullet, but it can definitely help.
Tayo?
And one of the things I wanted to add, that was such a good table setup, but if we're really discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion, you really have to get to the core of what makes people feel seen, heard, and understood. And if I asked you or anyone in the audience, hey, how do you feel seen? How do you feel understood? There's an element of inquiry that needs to be done. When I'm working with companies and we're either working on a distributed workforce base, or even if you're in person, what makes each employee or each department or each gender identity feel seen, heard, and understood is often left out of the policies. So right now, as companies are deciding whether they want to go hybrid, they want to stay virtual, or they want to, maybe go fully in person, I think it's important to be able to have even if it's a day or so, where the core elements of what they want to have in order to help them to be seen, to be there. Like, Joanne, you were talking earlier about how, when you think about, parents and caretakers, a lot of them found themselves in positions where they're parents and they were doing multiple things, and there was a routine that was built there. Now, this is a routine that's been happening for 15 months or so. Yes. And for some places more. So if you really step back and look at it, it would almost be ridiculous to say everything you've been doing for 15 months, especially those kids who have come used to something, you're going to take that away from them without setting some sort of transition. Now, that's the individual, and them, allowing them to inform you on what works best for them, right? As a company, I will also encourage, if you want to look at it through an inclusive lens, you want to refine your mission, vision, and values. This speaks to your company culture. Your mission is who you are. You want to check to make sure you are who you are. Your vision is where you're headed.
Yeah, the DNA.
And then the values have to really do with whether your company culture or organizational culture is in line with everything that has happened, everything that we've seen from a structural level, from a societal level, from a governmental level? Or how are we providing those resources for people to feel seen, heard, and understood? There was a lady in Canada, she's on the Canadian basketball team, and she was made to choose, just recently, she was made to choose between pumping, for a kid or playing basketball, all right, for the Tokyo Olympics. And that was basically the choice, right? Choose this or that. And now I think now that she's able to carry a baby, but that was due to pressure. But things like that you can't make policies without involving people. That's lack of inclusion. You can't go back to the same thing and say, hey, well, pandemic's over, vaccines are out, let's just come back like nothing has happened, without actually having inquiry in place and letting the people that you serve tell you what it is that will make them feel safe, what it is that will make them feel seen, and what it is that they really want to continue or go back to.
Can I just jump in on that as well?
Of course,
that process, I think it's super important for companies, when they're planning their back to work, remote work, hybrid, whatever it's going to be, strategy, that part of that process, when they're asking people, they're gathering information on who's asking, who wants to work remotely and why. And the reason I say that is I've seen there was an article in The Economist, I just saw it yesterday, where it said there's a big discrepancy, for example, between Black and Latino workers in the States and white workers in terms of who wants to go fully remote. It's something like 5% of Black Latino workers want to go back to the office, whereas there's 20%, who want to go fully in the office, where 20% of white workers would like to go fully in the office. So there's a question there around what is it about being in the office that those Black Latino employees feel isn't going to help them in their career. And there's cultural questions to be asked, and a lot of digging deeper that needs to go into that. So asking people why you want to work remotely or why you want to be back in the office. Is it because you've got caring responsibilities? And with that, then planning your processes, your policies around that, so that you make sure, if it's the case that more women than men want to work remotely or whatever it is, that you're building an inclusive workforce and an inclusive model so that they're not disadvantaged. They're treated exactly the same. Pre-pandemic, if you ask for flexible working, it killed your career. It really did hurt your career.
Absolutely, yes.
That has to change.
I mean, I had to, even in my previous corporate life, I actually forced my previous management. I did, better say sorry than ask for permission. I'll be very honest. This is what I did, right? But to your point, and Paul, right after that question, I'd like to ask you specifically about relocation and what's the demand like. John, who's in the back scene with his magic fingers, we received a very interesting question from one of our audience members, and I'd love to be able to play that question just right now, because it actually touches and it complements very nicely what we've just been discussing. So, John, I don't know if this is a bit too early or if you're ready to play it. Just let me know. It would be wonderful.
Hi, I'm Claire Kumar, an executive productivity coach in Toronto, and really interested in the conversation around work from anywhere and inclusivity around two things. Number one, invisible illness, and number two, neurodiversity. I think these two populations, which are 14% for those with an invisible illness and neurodivergent thinking, 1 in 5 people. And I think I haven't heard a lot about the importance of respecting inclusivity for these two particular groups, which is a whole lot of people. And I'd really love to learn what you think about that.
So I thought it was complements very nicely what we said. Forbes actually published an article as well, highlighting this and saying that hybrid remote work improved the D&I. And they actually highlighted 3 areas. People with primary family care responsibilities, exactly what you said, Joanne, the majority of whom are women. Second, people with physical or mental health disabilities. And third, people facing economic housing limitations with all the long commute. Who would like to address that question?
I can go by. I want Paul to. Paul, you haven't said. I know you wanted to say something the last time, so. Please,
yeah, well,
sorry, Paul. Go ahead.
I feel like this question is a sort of a perfect extension of what Tayo and Joanne were saying previously around, I think working from anywhere in itself is a great opportunity, but isn't sort of like the end game for doing this well. And it can be a risk if you aren't seeing people. It's easy to then forget them as well. And actually, I think Joanne's point about looking into the reason why certain groups might prefer working remotely rather than going back into the office is a great opportunity to then dive in and look at some of the more structural issues around how you can make your workplace better for every group. And that I feel leads to invisible illness, neurodiversity as well. But I think those two buckets in particular are might not necessarily come through in traditional surveys necessarily, but really show like you kind of have to engage and inquire with your employees, as Tayo said at the top. You can't just say, oh, how great, we have this flexibility with people, let's just leave it at that and everyone can't complain. It's something we struggle with at Perchpeek, and we see our clients sort of thinking about, certainly clients that are thinking about it are great, but you really have to be much more proactive about inquiring, because you're not just going to bump into someone, and you have to take the time and create spaces to talk about and think about these things.
So I really thank you, Paul, for saying that. I really love that question, because it's one that I that I love working with companies on. And I always say that there are two questions to really foster belonging, accessibility, inclusion, diversity, and equity. So if you're thinking about the invisible diversity or anything to do with identity, most people judge people based on what they can see, right? If I asked you to tell me a lot of, what makes you, or what makes me. I mean, outside of, you probably see my love for LeBron over there, but you won't be able to tell I'm a LeBron fan or Nigerian or any of these things without inquiry, without question, without probing. You might say this guy's black. You might say he's he's tall. He looks like over 6 foot, but the core of what makes you is often invisible, something you can't see. It's the same thing for disability and mental health. And oftentimes we're making policies based on what we've assumed or what we've extrapolated. So I think that there are two questions that companies can start asking their employees even now. Yep. And the first question is, what's the most surprising thing that you've learned recently? Something as broad as that. What's the most surprising thing you've learned? Yeah. And then the second question is, what do you wish more people knew about ? Now, if I want to go back to the first question, if I say, what's the most surprising thing you've learned recently? The reason why this is an important question is that this invites opportunities to develop those curiosity muscles, as well as opportunities to develop subject matter experts. In one of the companies I was working with, it was an opportunity for someone to talk about their gender identity. They are, they're non-binary, and they talked about what it was like to have a bathroom that was, gender non-binary, and how it was to use their pronouns and what it was like to walk in their shoes. But it was an opportunity for them to invite stories, and these stories influence worldviews. Your worldview is shaped by your lived experience, your exposure levels. So as you expand your worldview, you bulk up your curiosity muscles, and then you start to understand all those invisible things, and you create those things that make it accessible for people dealing with several things, whether it has to do with anxiety, depression, or even things that they don't normally talk about. Now, the second question, which is, what do you wish more people knew about? It could be anything to do with your experience at the company, your career development, what it's like for you to get to work, what it's like for you to wake up, what it's like for you to deal with all these things. But when you invite more stories, you create more seats at the table. And those seats end up having more accessibility and belonging. And if you make diversity more about perspectives and worldviews, you actually have inclusion. So it's such an interesting perspective with that.
I think that's fantastic. I love that, because I think often when we make policies, we make decisions, they're based on this premise that everybody is equal. But everybody's not equal. And people's reaction to change, or people's reaction to a policy, or reaction to something happening, it's very much dependent on their own lived experiences, their identity, who they are as people. You can't, and I think and it's very difficult. We're asking a lot of employers here, because we're asking them to understand these complex structural social issues. But I think it's asking people to tell you their lived perspectives, That's it. That's a really nice gateway to do that without having to get your head around the complexity of identity, of gender, all these things that people Theo has studied and we know are hard. But I think it's opening the door to let people tell you. Then okay, I make this policy. It doesn't affect you the same way as it affects you because of your lived experience. So I really like that.
And I think that's the big opportunity over there. And I think Francine had a good comment about the last 16 months being the big pilot. Is now the sort of cat's out of the bag. Employees have shown that they can work effectively no matter sort of where and exclusively. This sort of top-down control from companies, it feels a bit ludicrous at times now, because it's kind of, well, it's been working well the last 16 months, so why should we now go back to dictating, where, when, how? And you've seen, some high-profile companies have to almost row back their back to office sort of commitments over the last 2 months.
Yeah. Big topic right now in the Silicon Valley with the huge billboards and Apple.
Exactly.
There's a lot going on, right?
Exactly.
I don't know if any of you are. I'm a bit of a nerd, so I don't know if any of you watched the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But there's a scene where Thanos snaps whatever. For years, the world is very different. Then people start to come back, and people come back to something that's different. Now, it mirrors the pandemic in the sense that I think you're going to miss out on DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, if you're expecting whatever the old normal was. I think we need to adapt to that. The fact that it's a new normal, wherever. Even people that were doing remote work before this will tell you that this isn't actually remote work for them.
At all.
They will say that, but some people have lumped them together. But other people will say, I just can't wait to get back to this. But other people they're fallen in the hybrid, and other people have gotten access to all those things. And so it's very important for companies not to discard people that have now accepted this as a new normal in favor of whatever they were chasing for in the past. Because if you're doing that, that's going to be exclusive. And then you're going to go back to the same problems. You're going to create hierarchy systems. You're going to normalize things that favor ableism, things that favor heteronormative behavior, things that favor those extroverts as opposed to the introverts, and all those things. And those are the things that people need to be careful of. I said extroverts, I said heteronormative. All these things, they might not be typically out there in the open, but people who have been waiting for these, who are finally saying, yes, it's finally our turn. That's not how a company should be thinking. There needs to be a culture of accountability there that reminds people that not everybody is the same, as you were saying, Joanne, but also there's a new normal. And it just has to, you just have to understand that it's not the same. Yeah.
And it's even that the new normal, nobody really knows what it's going to look like, because it's shaping up right now. And there's something I really like, and I would like to bridge this. So I really like the fact that, you see things and you perceive the world and people based on your experience, exactly what you said, Tayo, your cultural background as well, most probably. When it comes to the corporate life, it's also the company culture, the mindsets. And there's another element I'd like to put on the table. It's the resources. Talking about, diversity and inclusion and how to make it possible. Because we also tend to associate remote work from anywhere with, I love to travel the world. I want to experience other cultures, because now it's more possible than ever before, I would say. And the Work From Anywhere team launched a quick survey a couple of months ago. And we asked, actually, the top motivation for traveling abroad was to discover the local culture. So I have two questions in one. One for you, Paul, based on all the demand, the relocation, everything that you've been seeing as a more recent company. That's quite what's exciting, right? Because we never really knew a world pre-COVID. Yeah. What's the demand like, and what's the reason for that? And for Tayo and Joanne, is that really accessible for everyone? Well, I guess the answer right now is a little bit more leaning towards the no, but how can we make it more accessible? So maybe let's start with you, Paul.
Yeah, and I think that's, to counter that I would say another, and probably the biggest reason we've seen for people relocating over the last year has just to be close to home and family. Like loads of people who had to move back to, or who had been relocated to London and San Francisco, just going back home to be with family during the pandemic. It's been a massive driver of relocation. And so that working from anywhere, we have a lot of people who, I mean, myself included, like, I spent a few months in Athens last year. That would have been very hard to do what would have been very hard for me to find a job in Athens previously. That's like, there's not many jobs for someone like me. It would have been hard to do. That's great. And, it's nice to be able to experience the culture, etc. But I think that's a benefit of the nuance of having the flexibility rather than designing policies around that sort of specific subset of people who have the luxury of being able to travel to experience new cultures. That's a huge potential upside. I mean, lots of people had said, I'd love to try living here. I'd love to go live in like the south of Spain and eat tapas all day or whatever. And that's potentially, we're going to see a lot more migration over the next 5 years as people have more opportunity to work and travel together. But that shouldn't necessarily, in our view, be like the sort of defining premise of companies setting policies to sort of favor that group, because they're naturally sort of benefited by the ability to work remotely anyway.
Great point from Bidu. Exactly, like bridging exactly the work from anywhere with travel and experience new things. But isn't that mostly right now for more privileged people? And I include myself in that.
Yep, definitely. That's what I was going to bring up. Sorry. So I just, the thing with COVID and what's happening is it's not, the world is not experiencing the vaccine or the wave in equitable format. Some countries that prior to pandemic might have been the destination of destinations are really feeling hit. I'm from Nigeria, for example. Right? I'm 100% Nigeria, and my parents are there, and we always talk about the country needing more vaccines. Here in the United States, there are people arguing about whether they want vaccines. Right? That's an element of privilege there. But the other thing that comes with that is the access. So what sometimes I do fear is that maybe the countries that are open end up favoring all these, ushering all these new remote type of workers who would then disadvantage the other workers in all these countries who are still trying to figure out how to get vaccines. So I just want us to be very careful about that too, because in the rush to get back to quote unquote whatever that normal is, there is a further opportunity to maybe create more of a divide from those elements as well. So yeah, that was the point I will add to that.
Joanne, I see you nodding.
I agree. Yeah, I'm nodding away here when you said privilege. I agree with you completely. I think it will start to, time will tell. Obviously, we're kind of at the beginning of the next phase of this experiment when it comes to remote. But I think there are most jobs that people are working in remotely right now are quite high paying jobs. They're in tech, a lot of these jobs in tech. These are the companies that are probably going to be embracing the fully remote model more than other types of roles. So I think there is an element of privilege in terms of access to a remote job. I think there's a great opportunity for upskilling people across into other remote, from non-remote into remote jobs. I think there's a lot of training and upskilling that can be done there. But I really think companies need to understand it's not just tech jobs that can be fully remote. There are so many types of jobs that can be fully remote across a whole range of industries, across a whole range of levels. But I think the fear there is that it will stay those high-paying tech jobs, the developers, those globally mobile jobs where there's high demand for talent. Those are the jobs that will stay remote, and they are the cohort who will be able to realize that privilege of being able to travel and be globally mobile. Right. There's also there's a divide between the more low income versus high income countries in terms of who's based there, what companies are based there, who's making remote jobs available. So I do think there's a lot of potential there. There's again back to there is opportunity, but there is a lot of potential there for division, for further widening inequalities.
Yeah, I think another opportunity exists in the word essential. If you remember, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this core group of essential workers, and a lot of them, outside people in the medical force, were delivery folks, people that were in the groceries, farmers, all these, and for people, many of us take them for granted. They often have the lowest pay, and they have and they have the caregivers, where they're caregivers, right? They're providing for many of their families, and I thought that was such a microcosm of how sometimes we further divide and create wealth in such a way where we take for granted the essential ingredients to our end product.
We forget the people elements.
Yeah, and we're also exposing them to the disease without protecting them. And so if you're thinking about your company and you think about being more inclusive, it must seem ridiculous to you as an executive, because you are in a club that you acquire, you build, whatever. Maybe you don't see humans as people, but you have to apply that analogy to your workforce as well. There are essential people in your company who make it what it is. You can't afford to dehumanize them, because the more you dehumanize them, you're actually endangering the whole source. People often say bad apples, but I'm thinking about I think the root is the root. The tree itself is bad, and it's sprouting all these models where the way we see leadership is not valuing people on varying degrees, in a humanizing way. So that's something else I wanted to add to that, because I think that's something else that needs to change in order for us to understand and value and company culture and inclusion and making sure that we really create opportunity.
And what would be your top tip or typically, again, two questions in one. I'd like to address this one for you as well, Joanne. So, first is what would be the top tip for a company who has more of a remote or distributed workforce? Because we addressed that at the beginning, and I've recently seen an article by HBR saying that employees have never been lonelier, and that this has put the well-being of employees top of mind for most companies. And I actually think you can be lonely even like as an essential worker, because you can feel even more isolated than ever before because of the situation right now. So how do you build that sense of belonging, and how do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, and that's top of mind, I think, for most employers at the moment, because pre-pandemic, the big concern with remote work for an employer, for a leader, was probably productivity. What would be the impact? And I think we've put that concern to bed very much in the last year, because employees are, in fact, being overproductive when they work from home, as far as the research has shown. So now it's moved more towards the well-being of employees. I do think, and I think it was Theo that touched on this earlier as well, what we've seen in the last year and a half is not remote working as we all on this call would envisage remote working. It was crisis management. It was working remotely in an emergency. People were sent home with their whatever they could carry. If they were lucky, if they had an office chair that they could steal from the office, they were they were locked in their houses. They couldn't meet their friends. They were trapped with their spouses and their cats climbing on the keyboard and all of that. That's not how remote working should be. So I think that's an important point to make. So a lot of the isolation I think people have felt in the last year, I mean, we can put some of that down to the fact that we have been isolated from each other because of the pandemic. That's not to say that isolation is not an issue for remote employees, and it is. And that's one of the reasons why the organization that I work for exists, to help work towards solving for the social isolation that remote workers have. So there's almost two pieces to it. So there's what the organizations can do, but then there's also what remote workers can do in terms of building their own communities outside of the office, but within their local community. So when it comes to the employers, there's a misconception still, I think, that you need the office to drive collaboration and to drive interaction. So I think employers need to change their mindset around that. The physical office space is not the only place where people can connect. It can be used, and a lot of employers are staying with the hybrid model. That's where it looks like 60% of companies are going, and they will use the office for collaboration. But you can collaborate, you can connect with your team, with each other in a virtual world. I mean, we're doing it today, we're doing it right now. We're talking to each other. You just need to be very intentional and very deliberate in how you plan it. You need to be very Your managers need to be well trained. How do you keep in touch with your employees, check in with them regularly, give them opportunities to share, whether it's through Slack or whether it's through Zoom. There's plenty of tools you can use, but you have to build that culture within your team. So for remote first organizations, there's a lot of companies we work with that are remote that are fantastic at this. They wouldn't ever question that they'd never say, what do you mean you can't innovate, you can't collaborate? Of course you can, we do it every day. But for a lot of employers, that's a learning curve that they're on right now. Outside of the office then, there's also communities of remote workers that we work with all across our country, as I mentioned before.
I was going to ask you that question.
Yeah. So these are chapters, as we call them. These are remote workers from different companies that have come together just because they live in an area, and it's that local versus global dynamic, which is really nice when it comes to remote working. You can work for a global organization, but you can connect locally with other people who live in your area. So we have chapters they're very self-perpetuating, self-driving, they're community-led. We're a community development organization at heart. So we enable them, we help them with resources that they may need, but they get together. Before the pandemic, they would meet face-to-face. Now they meet virtually. Hopefully going forward, they have regular meetups, they have events, they drive awareness of remote jobs that people in that area might not know about, because that's super important as well. Some of these jobs, there's no one place where you can go and find all the remote jobs in Ireland. So they evangelize for remote work locally. They support each other. They solve for the isolation of remote working.
Nice. Yeah, it's and thank you, Claire and Francine. Both are very, very active, and thanks for sharing your comments. And I agree, people are the greatest asset to the company, because without people, your company is nothing. It's the people that make the success of the company, right? So if we think about, so instead of looking like through a microscope, I would like to look at things like with a macroscope. I just made up a word. Theo, you have a TEDx talk, and it's called The Art of Diplomacy. And you said something that stuck with me. You said the skill of cultural competence is the most important skill that we can develop in the 21st century. So now that we're becoming an even more global, connected world with an even more distributed workforce, the question is, how can we achieve that? How can we create an even better world?
Thank you, by the way, for watching the talk.
I did my homework.
Yeah, no, I mean, I grew up as the son of a diplomat, so I learned a lot. And in my book, I broke it down into 3 phases. But before we can even get to where we want to get to, there's an element of self-awareness that we all need to have, and that self-awareness involves understanding what I call our BTVs, our biases, our triggers, and our values, right? So your biases, they come from story, fear, avoidance, security. So if you think about story, maybe it's a religion that's been passed on, or philosophy you've read in school, or someone in your sphere of influence has said. So, but it's shaped how you see the world, your bias. Fear, maybe you've repeatedly had bad experiences with a particular group of people or a particular nation or whatever nationalities, and then that influences how you see the world. When you think about security, a way for you to feel better by yourself, or avoidance, when you avoid difficult topics or topics that make you uncomfortable, what your brain is going to do is it's going to fill it up with what's already out there, which if it's not checked or investigated, it's often untrue. And then with triggers, I think one of the things that we learned, especially during the pandemic, is we had interesting reactions to many things. I remember personally, during the height of Black Lives Matter, a lot of what was happening, whether it was George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, a lot of these things were triggering for me because I had gone through many of those things. But they were also really just heightened in the sense where I remember having panic attacks. I remember sitting down in different places, but other people will have different reactions to whatever is happening. But it's very important for us to understand why those reactions are happening, because they often are clues as to what's really bothering us, or what's happening there, and what's what we need to create in terms of boundaries and to understand our safety. And values, I encourage everyone here to be able to articulate what the 5 core values are and to live according to those values on a daily basis, because when companies don't know what their values are, they become strangers, right, to themselves. When people don't know what the values are, they become strangers to themselves. And so if you're thinking about any company that has done something morally object. No company has ever had a mission statement that said we promise to embezzle $20 million or make this place unsafe for women and people of color. It's often when we stray away from that and there's no level of intentionality there. And when you don't have that intentionality, you become programmed. And when you're too reactive, you're not reflective enough. And so if you want to develop that level of cultural competency, you need to first understand your biases so you know where you need to work on and what you need to double down on. You need to understand your triggers so you're able to create boundaries, but also understand your reactions. And you need to understand your values because your values do inform how you move in the world and how you create a level of accountability for yourself when you're straying away from that person. And the more we do that as a world, as a group, as a company, as an institution, you're going to find that there will be more open dialogue, but also there'll be more opportunities for people to really reflect on things from a different perspective, a nuanced view.
Love that. It's very insightful. Camilla has asked a question. I'm reading it. Thank you so much, Theo, for your perspectives. Talking about burnouts, that can be a little bit less visible or do not exist indeed when everything is so blurred between personal and professional life. Paul, I see you nodding. Do you like to share your thoughts with Camilla?
Yeah, I think for us, burnout crosses over into like just the way the world has gone, right? Everyone's got their phone on them the whole time. You're always connected. It's the last thing you check before you go to bed. First thing you check in the morning, often, if you have awful habits like me. And that's not this, and that sort of all feeds into burnout, almost a little bit even outside of this discussion. I think what's hard is during the pandemic, you have very little. Or you had very little kind of social interaction. Everyone was forced inside, etc. And so there is an opportunity to readjust. I actually wanted to ask Joanne a question there because I love the idea of these chapters that you're sort of working on. But I think one of the pushbacks we've always had, both ourselves and with companies, is where they don't exist and where sort of certain employees often based a lot of their got a lot of social currency from workplace relationships, and there's a lot of Zoom fatigue. What sort of mechanisms have you seen companies putting in place to help like create a good remote working environment that isn't just sitting on another Zoom 24/7 or, like a Zoom quiz at the end of the day when people have been sitting on Zoom the whole week, if they don't have the luxury of like a local community, or if the company just wants to foster good relationships between its people?
Yeah, and a lot of companies are being quite creative now in how they do that. And I think it's a common misconception about remote work is people don't meet, like the company doesn't get people to meet together. But that's not true. Most of the large remote organizations that we work with, they would organize meetups in different ways. So Shopify, for example, they're a big employer. They're a global e-commerce company. They have a lot of employees in Ireland. They would have meetups that they would schedule for employees, and they tend to hire in certain areas so that there's a few people in a certain area. And I've heard of organizations doing this in the States as well, where they would pick a certain area, a certain state, and they would look for talent there, so that there are these clusters of employees together that can then meet up face to face. I know of other organizations, because they're saving so much money on real estate because they don't have a physical office anymore, they can afford to bring their entire organization together somewhere really nice. So we had a company, I was on another session this morning with an organization called Nearfarm. They're a fully remote company based in Ireland. They bring all of their team together and they go on a cruise, or they go on they go to Orlando for a week. And companies can afford that now. They can put that money that they did pay into their buildings, into their rent, into whatever the other expenses that come with having a physical office, and they can put that into more creative ways of bringing their employees together. So it's not, and maybe I should say this isn't one of the most common misconceptions about remote work is people don't meet, but they actually do meet. They just meet in their own terms, in their own way, and they get to enjoy the flexibility. And it's not necessarily mandated that they have to go to the office 3 days a week so that they can interact with each other. It's done in these kind of ways, in a more creative way.
Yeah,
it actually makes.
Oh, sorry, you go, Molly.
it makes me think of something I've read on LinkedIn recently, and there was a powerful statement saying that we need to stop thinking in terms of how we used to do things, but we need to think in terms of human behaviors to now redesign the way that we're working and to actually tackle that work-life balance. And just to complement Joanne, I mean, with my team, we're a team of consultants, so we're fully virtual. We never had any office in 5 years. And our playground is exactly business travel and meetings management. And this is exactly what we're seeing with our clients. We're in touch with procurement leaders, with travel leaders, travel managers, who are in this process of redesigning the way that they deal with meetings and business travel within organizations. So all those offsite meetings, and we see an uptake of small meetings. And there's also then an uptake of new IT tools that are required to book this online. HQ, some like BP typically have just sold their huge HQ in London, and they just have actually developed a tool to book for their employees to book local co-work spaces or small teams together, wherever they are. So there's a very interesting shift, happening right now.
There is, and actually on the co-working spaces, I know, again, I'm referring to Ireland because that's where I'm based, but there's a big push to develop co-working spaces. There's 400 co-working spaces that are going to get funding by the government here, because they're another way to bring people together under one roof. Again, they may be from different companies, or if there's a few people in the same area, they could come together. And it's just a nice way to have that environment that you might miss sometimes when you're home in your house and it's very quiet, where you can have a little bit of hustle and bustle of people around you, get to chat to people, have a coffee, have those water cooler moments that everybody talks about being so important.
Exactly. Theo, you had a comment? And after that, I would love to ask you a burning question to close this.
Oh, sorry. I don't want to take too much.
No, go ahead.
I did want to tackle the burnout question. And so, in like much of my style, I'm going to use a story. So there's a kid that I mentor as a part of Big Brother, Big Sister. It's an organization here that pairs mentors up with people. And I've had him since 2016. And, initially, he grew up in a very tough neighborhood, third foster home. Now he's getting adopted. But I remember I would try to engage with him multiple times throughout the years. And I'm like, man, I don't know if I'm doing anything right. And then one day I just asked him, hey, one day actually he came up to me and he said, hey, I just want to thank you for always being here. And I was like, wait, what? It's like, yeah, no, you do what you say you're going to do. You come here at the same time and you do that. And I really appreciate that. And it took me a while. But then what I realized that he was saying is that he had gotten so used to disappointment and people not living up to the promise or seeing them or showing up regardless. And I'm bringing that story as a metaphor for anyone going through burnout, any of these things. Companies have to be authentic in terms of what it is that they are. If you want, it needs to be, if you want a company that is willing to talk to you when they're going through burnout, you have to model that. I remember when Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, was nursing during the pandemic.
I remember that, yeah.
We can't forget, she's a mother, but she decided to show she was a mother. It was a very humanizing moment. So if leaders here are actually going through tough times, having problems getting customers, any of those things, I always encourage people to actually model and communicate those things, because no one is under the impression that you are some robot. But if you don't do that, they're not going to feel like they're going to be able to do that. And so you do that out, you pair that up with something I call empathy hours, where instead of happy hour, it's an hour where you talk about anything but work. And you create opportunities for people to say, hey, I need this day off. And then you start to create more mental days off and all these things. But if you don't model it, if you don't show up consistently, if you don't create an idea of authentic ability, the people you lead will not be able to come up to tell you something in the most vulnerable moment.
And can I just jump in, Aurelie, briefly? I know you're probably watching the time, but just on that burnout question, I think that one of the best and also worst things that's happened in the last year has been the blurred line between private and public life, by private life being life at home and public being life at work. So the best thing about it is the flexibility, the recognition that people have a life outside of home. I have a young daughter. I'm a lone parent. My daughter interrupts my Zoom calls all the time. Everybody's cool with it now. You know, everyone knows I have responsibilities. I have great flexibility because I can get up in the morning, work early. I can walk my dog, and at 2 in the afternoon, I can log on later. So all that flexibility and that the nice part of the blurred lines between private and public is fantastic. I think where the burnout comes in is what Paul was saying. There's a double-edged sword there because there's blurred lines between public and private life, then employees feel that they're expected to be always on. The responsibility there lies with the employer 100%. The employer is responsible for people. They have a duty of care. And if they're not managing that, if they're not, checking in with people, making sure that they're taking care of them, then they're letting their people down.
Actually, there's a law that has been passed in France, and it's like the right to disconnect. So legally, you do not have to answer after a certain time emails or whatsoever. So it's starting to become a legal affair as well now in some countries.
Yeah, they're bringing that in Ireland as well in September.
And there's also, I think, Germany was in the process also of passing a law like making remote work actually written like properly as a law, like as a right for employees. So there's more and more things that are shaping up as well. So to close this amazing session, I know we're a little bit, John, excuse us, we got carried away. We're a little bit behind schedule, but I have a burning question, Paul. I promised I was going to ask you first. There you go. What is the untold truth when we talk about remote work or work from anywhere?
So I think for us, we see a lot of companies rushing to create a policy around this, around working remote or working from anywhere. I think the untold truth is this isn't going to be a one-time thing where you make this big change, you introduce a policy, and then you sort of forget about it, and it's happy ever after, big claps on the back for everyone that came up with the policy. This is going to be a sort of a defining factor in how people work ongoing from now on, and it's constantly going to be looked at, and it's constantly going to be iterated, and companies that are hiring heads of remote work, getting in front of this, are going to be best placed ultimately to attract and retain talent, rather than companies that want to put a band-aid on it now and sort of move on with life as it was before.
Thanks. Joanne, what is the untold truth of work from anywhere?
So I don't want to sound negative, but I think one thing that is not said outwardly is how hard it is to bring in remote work. Remote working is a very difficult model to implement for a company who hasn't done it before. So we may have learned about it in the last year, but really it's not a great template to follow the last year, maybe. So it's almost like going back to the drawing board. And I think companies need to recognize it needs an entire review and restructuring and transformation of your operating model, of your strategy. It infiltrates every aspect of your business. You need to look at every policy in great detail. You bring it down to the most granular level, and you can drive yourself crazy with the what ifs. You go down to, what if this situation versus that situation. So I think it is very hard, and we don't really know. It's sort of echoing a little bit what Paul said. We don't really know how it's going to go. So being adaptable, being resilient, and being ready to change and shift and pivot is super important. This next stage is a period of experimentation. We don't really know what's going to lead.
To complement that, before going to you, Theo, there are two companies who have been particularly open about that. Darren Murph has published, and it's openly accessible by anyone, the remote work guidelines and like a handbook at GitLab. They just ran an amazing event this week on remote work. And Twitter. Twitter has been very vocal on that as well, and has been sharing a lot of best practices. So if in the audience everybody wants to look at this, feel free. It's going to be a good source of inspiration. Theo, what is your untold truth of work from anywhere?
I think the untold truth from work from anywhere is very similar to what Joanne said, but it's that we don't actually know what we're doing, honestly, in its entirety.
It's great to admit it, right?
Yeah. And the reason is, I don't want to be entirely dismissive. Of course, they're best practices and things like that. But on the core, there are policies that I know work for certain countries that don't work for other countries, policies that work for certain individuals that don't work for certain individuals. But if you're talking about work from anywhere, you're including keyboards, resources, internet access, phone, politics, all these things, visas, and the fact of the matter is, they are going to look very different from many of those companies, and it's important to remember that as we are, thinking about how to implement that in the workforce. So, if you do say you want to hire internationally, then you need to be honest with yourself about what that comes with. You can't apply what domestic policies normally would for international policies. So that's what.
So probably in a nutshell, it's the doing part that's the untold truth. Like, it's one thing to discuss and explore and talk about all the trends, but actually going, like taking the matter, like between two hands is really what's the most tricky part. Thank you so much to the three of you. So to our audience as well, we stole 6 minutes of your time. So thank you so much for sticking with us until the very end of this great conversation. I really enjoyed it. To our audience, feel free to connect with Paul, Joanne, Theo on LinkedIn, everywhere you can find them on social media. I'm sure everybody would love to pursue that conversation. Thank you to the three of you. Really, really grateful for the time you spent with us today.
Cheers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aurelie.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I will let John share a little teaser for next week. You're on. Thank you so much.